Hello, my name is Alistair Somerville, the producer of Diplomatic Immunity. We're on a short break for the summer, but we wanted to bring you one of our favourite episodes from Season 2, a perfect listen for any travel you might be doing over the long weekend. In April and May, we released a 6-part mini-series looking at the work of diplomats, scholars and activists during the Arab Spring, reflecting on events 10 years on. In the first episode, we had spoken to Ambassador Gordon Gray, US Ambassador in Tunis during the revolution of 2010-2011, Youssef Cherif, a Tunisian political analyst and director of Columbia University's Global Center in Tunis, and Tamara Cofman Wittes, who served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State during the Obama administration and provided the view from Washington during those early days of the uprisings. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and encourage you to check out the other episodes in the miniseries using the links in the show notes. You can join the conversation with us by sending any feedback about our podcast to diplomacy@georgetown.edu or by following the Institute on Twitter @GUDiplomacy. We look forward to returning soon with more frank and candid conversations about diplomacy and the work of diplomats around the world. But for now, enjoy this episode of our Diplomacy and the Arab Spring at 10 mini-series.
The protests began in December, expressing pent-up anger over unemployment and rising food prices. They continued despite clashes with police that became deadly. On Friday, police fired tear gas at thousands of protesters who took to the streets. President Ben Ali fled following the worst unrest of his 23-year rule.
In the week after the Tunisian dictator, Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali, fled Tunis for Saudi Arabia in January 2011, the U.S. ambassador to Tunisia, Gordon Gray, made the first public statement from the U.S. Embassy in Tunis on events unfolding in the country. "The Tunisian people have spoken," he said, as the world watched the dictator's fall. The self-immolation of the street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi on December 17, 2010, had triggered protests that brought down a 23-year dictatorship just 4 weeks later. Fast forward to today, and the last few months have marked the 10th anniversary of uprisings that took place throughout the Arab world. Revolutions shaped from within and from without, by grassroots movements, by political elites, and by outside powers, including the United States.
Over the next few weeks, we'll bring you a series of conversations with participants in those events as part of a special podcast mini-series, Diplomacy and the Arab Spring at 10. I'm Alistair Somerville, producer of this podcast and editor at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy.
And I'm Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at ISD. As the Arab Spring revolutions broke out, I was working in the office of the historian at the Department of State, fresh off of a 3-month rotation as an Arabian Peninsula analyst in State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, also known as INR. In the summer of 2011, I would return to INR on a permanent basis and would spend the next 5 years there. And the conversations we had throughout this mini-series brought back vivid memories of my time as an intelligence analyst in the early part of last decade, as my colleagues in the intelligence community and I tried to figure out how events in the region would ultimately play out.
Together, we'll take you through the stories of some of the key countries in the region. Tunisia, where it all began. Egypt, Yemen, Libya, and Syria all experienced revolution, protests against a brutal regime, government crackdowns, and contested aftermaths. We wanted to find out how the revolutions unfolded from both a diplomatic perspective and from the point of view of those who experienced the revolution firsthand on the ground. How do different voices from the US and around the region reflect on the revolutions 10 years on?
So in each episode of this miniseries, you'll hear a conversation between a former high-ranking US diplomat, in each case, the ambassador to the country in question, and a next-generation thinker from the region, someone who came of age during the Arab Spring and who continues to engage and shape events in the region. We hope these intergenerational conversations will bring new insights into the unfolding story of revolution, continuity, and change in the Arab world.
Today we'll explore the early days of the Tunisian story, through a conversation between Ambassador Gordon Gray.
Good morning, I'm Gordon Gray. I'm currently serving as the Chief Operating Officer at the Center for American Progress here in Washington, D.C. And at the time that the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, I was the U.S. ambassador there.
And Youssef Cherif.
I'm Youssef Cherif, Director of Columbia Global Centers Tunis. And in 2010, I was a fresh graduate. I just had my master's by then, and I was working at an NGO and blogging on public affairs.
You'll also hear other voices who will help guide us through the series.
I'm Tamara Cofman Wittes. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And during the Arab uprisings, I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs.
Her perspective as both a scholar and practitioner with a focus on the Middle East helps us to make sense of broader trends before, during, and since the revolutions.
We'll begin with Ambassador Gray and Youssef's early recollections of events in Tunisia.
I think I started figuring out that it was something bigger than just irregular protests, even though during Ben Ali they were not so regular, protests were not so regular. But I started figuring out that it was important the second week after Bouazizi set himself on fire. And by then, it started to be on the international media, on international media outlets, and people started talking about it. And even among small circles, we started discussing this event as something that didn't resemble what existed in the past. But until the day of the fall of Ben Ali, I was not expecting Ben Ali to fall or to leave the country.
From my perspective, I'd agree completely with what you said, Youssef, that demonstrations were highly unusual in Tunisia. There may have been a couple of government-organized or government-tolerated demonstrations about the Palestinian issue during my time there before Arab Spring, but that would have been it. I arrived in September 2009. But for me, the image that for me indicated that this was something different was the photograph on December 29th, 2010 in the state-run papers. I mean, all the media was very tightly controlled. Youssef, you probably remember this photograph well. It was the photograph of Ben Ali visiting Mohammed Bouazizi, the resident of Sidi Bouzid, who set himself on fire and began all of this. Ben Ali was visiting him in the burn unit at a hospital, and Ben Ali was a very remote figure. And so the way I'd put it, the idea that the king would visit his subjects was highly, highly unusual, and that showed to me that they were taking it very seriously. And there was a confluence. He visited the Bouazizi in the hospital room. He also gave his first speech about this on December 28th. I mean, it was a very dismissive, aggressive speech, but the juxtaposition of the two indicated to me that the regime was very concerned about what was going on.
So yeah, that image, I think it was the second week of the revolution. Mm-hmm. So by the end of the second week of the revolution, and that's it showed that the regime was reacting, which was again not very usual for the Ben Ali regime. Although Tunisia by that time had that image of a very the cliche of very modern, westernized. Liberal. Some people used to call it a liberal country because it was socially more liberal than other countries in the region. But of course, from its political system, it was one of the most closed countries or states in the region. So it was very unusual for the regime to react to something happening in the street or something happening in general. And there was, of course, that picture that when it was published in the media, it was very quickly shared on social media. And on social media, actually, a lot of people were already criticizing the reaction of the regime and criticizing Ben Ali, which was already by then in the second week of the uprising, that was something that started to be felt, the criticism of the regime on social media. The regime also was reacting by censoring a number of bloggers, a number of activists online by then. And then during the third week, that was when the major repression was felt, when the numbers of people who were killed started, the figures started getting higher and higher, and there were even videos of people dead, some people in hospitals. So that was when things started really getting out of control. But then in, I think the most intense period was the 3 days that preceded the fall of Ben Ali, when protests started being seen or being organized in the capital city in Tunis. First of all, in the poorer neighborhoods of the country, and then that climaxed in the big demonstration that most of you saw on TV, and for most of the world, that was when people heard of the Tunisian revolution, the last day of Ben Ali, with big protests in front of the Ministry of Interior.
What did this all look like from Washington? As we go through the series, we'll try to piece together how decision makers in the US government viewed events across the region as the uprisings unfolded. Here's Tamara Cofman Wittes.
I came into office with a sense that the autocratic governments of the region were not necessarily as stable as they appeared. That was a minority view, both in my academic field of Middle East studies and also in the US government. But it was not, I wasn't the only person who felt that way by any means. Tunisia was a surprise because I think that Tunisia was, it appeared to be sort of the perfect police state. You know, it had a reasonably high rate of economic growth. It had trade with Europe. It was orderly and highly repressive. There was independent civil society, but it was highly guarded and surveilled and kept very small and marginal. And so for an uprising to begin in Tunisia, it seemed like the least likely place in the region to see that kind of uprising. Now, there had been unrest in Tunisia before. There had been the riots in Gafsa, in the mining region of Gafsa some years before, that were forcibly put down by the government. And so I think the initial assumption was, well, they'll forcibly put this down as well. And it became clear fairly quickly that that was not the way it was going to go.
Here's Gordon Gray.
Would you say that the violence, and when I say violence, I mean the security forces shooting unarmed demonstrators and killing at least 24 of them the weekend before, in other words, the weekend of January 8th, 9th in Tala and Kasserine, do you see that as a turning point that intensified the demonstrations?
At least for me, I still remember very well that weekend. I remember when I woke up on, I think it was Sunday morning or Monday morning, I can't remember, but it was the very early morning when I saw the videos from the night before from the hospital, either Tala or Kasserine. So then I thought that, wow, I mean, this regime is doing exactly what the Syrian regime or the Ba'ath regime was doing in Iraq before 2003 and other places. So this kind of mass slaughter, although it was not mass slaughter in the case of Tunisia, but killing more than one person, that was very uncommon in Tunisia. And so, at least on a personal level, I thought that, wow, this regime is not just criminal, because many of us thought that the regime was criminal, but this regime is overtly criminal, and now, I mean, it's bypassing red lines. So I think I felt that, and many people in Tunisia did feel that. But when that happened, already the regime was either arresting or killing people in different parts of the country. So the anger was already there in different cities and regions of Tunisia. But yes, that specific weekend was the one where maybe people from the northern part of Tunisia to the southernmost part of Tunisia, so that there is blood, there is a lot of blood, and there are civilian victims that are dying just because they were demonstrating. And then one has to remind the audience that in Tunisia, from day one to the end, demonstrations were peaceful.
In any situation, when an authoritarian regime starts killing its own citizens, it doesn't have to be in Tunisia, anywhere, that creates a tremendous pressure, I think, on the regime. And it creates tremendous fissures within society.
Meanwhile, regional and international pressure was building. Here's Tamara Wittes again.
So let's see. It's the middle of January. I am in Doha, Qatar. We're about to convene the G8 Broader Middle East and North Africa Summit, Forum for the Future. This is an initiative that was started by George W. Bush as part of his freedom agenda. It was an annual convening where G8 governments and Middle East governments would come together with civil society leaders to talk about reform. So we had this on the agenda for a long time. We'd been preparing for it for a long time. It was being co-hosted by the Canadians and the Qataris that year, and Secretary Clinton was coming to give a major speech. And notably, she was going to appear on a panel with a regional foreign minister, but also a regional business person and a regional civil society activist. And it just so happened that the civil society activist she was going to be on the panel with was Tunisian. So all of a sudden, the context for this event is radically different than what we initially understood. Now, she had already wanted to say something pretty provocative to the assembled foreign ministers, to try to create a sense of urgency around the issue of political reform and being responsive to demands. But then once the uprising began, that was an imperative. And so she did. She gave a speech. I think the famous line that often gets quoted is that the foundations of the region are sinking into the sand. Just before she gave that speech, she had had a meeting with civil society activists from around the region. One of them was Tunisian. He gave her, a kind of ground's eye view of just how broad the coalition was in Tunisia. And the next day, Ben Ali fled the country.
Here's Ambassador Gray.
When we look back, you look back at what happened, Mohamed Bouazizi self-immolated on Friday, December 17th. There were demonstrations. Ben Ali gave 3 speeches. Exactly 4 weeks later, Friday, January 14th, he went into exile. The people, as a result of the people rising up. Because it happened quickly, and notwithstanding the deaths we've talked about, certainly in comparison to other revolutions and other Arab Spring demonstrations and revolutions, it happened relatively peacefully. Again, not to diminish the lives lost. So therefore, in looking back, it looks as if it was preordained and that this was definitely going to happen. And I mean, I think that's just human nature. When you see events, you say, well, of course, that's the way it was going to turn out. But that's certainly, as someone on the ground at the time, there was no, it would have been unreasonable to predict on January 1st, first of all, that Ben Ali would leave in 2 weeks. It wasn't just Ben Ali, it was Mubarak on February 11th. It was Gaddafi, killed in October of 2011. It was Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen. You had 4 authoritarian dictators with 129 years of authoritarian rules among them. And it would have been, who would have predicted? I mean, I'd love to be able to say with honesty that I wrote that cable to Washington saying this is what's going to happen the year ahead, but maybe I could get away with it since cables are classified, but I can't get away with it with any maintaining any shred of integrity. But I guess another question I'd have for you is, do you think Ben Ali, when he left, in his mind, he was leaving for good? And the reason I ask that is a very senior official who is high up in the RCD and in the government after the revolution told me he had spoken to Ben Ali twice on the 14th. So one time in the morning, Ben Ali called him up to criticize him for an interview he had given. And then the second time he said it was like 2 PM. It was just kind of a routine matter. And he didn't have, at least he told me, he didn't have any indication that Ben Ali was going to leave. And I seem to recall an interview in Le Monde with the pilot of the plane that ended up taking him to Jeddah, who said he thought Ben Ali was just taking his family out of harm's way and was planning on coming back. But what is your perspective on that?
So this is very interesting because this is something that happened 10 years ago. Most of those who lived that period are still around. Mm-hmm. From the ministers, the first circles around Ben Ali and around the people around him, to the person who was cleaning the street when the convoy of Ben Ali was passing by, to the person who was guarding the airport gate when the cars came in, etc. So thousands of people who had the first-hand account saw things happening and were there. So in theory, we should have a definite account of what happened that day and what was in the mind of Ben Ali, etc. But until today, we still don't have that. And I remember several years later, whenever I would meet with foreign diplomats who were in the country, in Tunisia, maybe including you, I would ask, what really happened, because it is, and until today, it is still a question mark. And so some people would tell you, oh, I can't tell you because this is an issue of national security, but some people would just give you a version that contradicts another version. But to put it short, I don't think he was planning to leave. I think he could have remained in power if he had just put in under arrest part of his family, the ones who were hated the most, and used some repression. We've seen in a place like Syria, for instance, that worked. I think he could have stayed, but there is the personal part. So that story that actually he didn't want his son, his daughter, and his wife to leave alone, and that his wife and his son asked him to stay. I tend to believe that, because most people around Ben Ali would tell you that his weakest point is his son. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, so maybe in the last minute, his son pushed him to come to live with them, and so he went, thinking that he could go back. The other version, which is also quite credible, is that some people in the army, in the National Guard, in the Presidential Guard pushed him in the last minute to leave. So I put these two stories together, and so that's the part I do believe. But I think maybe until noon, he was not planning to leave the country.
For Youssef and other young Tunisians, Ben Ali's departure meant first analysing the situation and then figuring out what to do next.
I think, well, first of all, when Ben Ali left, there was a curfew in place and a lot of insecurity. So most of us were at home. But I remember that maybe already the day Ben Ali left, we were all talking some of us via Facebook, others via phone. What will happen next? What can we do, etc. But I think, at least on my end, it was more in the beginning trying to analyze what's happening and try to understand what's happening more than acting. However, I think just a few days later, I was meeting with friends, and friends were telling me that they were meeting with friends to discuss, and we were all trying to discuss what we can do next. It was not organized at all. It was just the feeling that there was a vacuum, and we needed to do something as citizens of that country. So this was just a few days. I can't tell you when exactly, but maybe 2-3 days later, there were a lot of groups of people meeting in different parts of the country, some in coffee shops, others in the streets, and there were already debates. I remember I've been in several of these, but I think by then, so we, when I say we, is people who were in their 20s, in their 30s, who wanted to do something, who were interested in public affairs in general, but not organized at all. So we ended up having these discussions, and that was it. But then there were a few organized groups that actually did fill the vacuum, be it organized political parties or politicized groups that became political parties. I was not part of these, but they are the ones who actually won the elections of October 2011 that year. So they were already preparing themselves by then, and the most organized group is the one that is actually still around today, which is Ennahda party, the party that emerged out of political Islam.
From our perspective at the embassy, our first responsibility was security, because as Youssef suggested, the security situation was uncertain at the time. What I would call the regular security forces very quickly faded into the background in a move of self-preservation, I think. And there was a bit of a gap, and that gap was filled by what here in the States we would call neighborhood watch type groups. Youssef, I don't know what your perspective is, but I had a lot of Tunisians tell me there was really an outburst of civic pride as neighborhoods came together. I had a lot of people tell me that it was the first time they spoke to their neighbors. Then the military came in to restore order and was very well received. Families, remember it was January, so it was cold. Families would cook warm meals for the soldiers. I saw tanks, or armored personnel carriers rather, festoon, people would put bouquets of flowers on them, things like that. So it was, military comes in to restore order is not the headline you're usually looking for in the Middle East or elsewhere. But in this case, it was the headline you were looking for. And it was, more importantly, it was the headline, I'd say, that the Tunisian people were looking for. So but the situation was, I wouldn't say it was particularly dangerous considering the circumstances. I mean, as Youssef had described the demonstrations, they were very peaceful. So we pretty quickly tried to pivot to how we could help support the transition. I remember I think the first public statement I gave was an op-ed saying the Tunisian people have spoken. Our orientation was that this was a Tunisian accomplishment, and there was no interest in trying to muddy the waters by having foreign fingerprints, and particularly not American fingerprints on it, both because it wouldn't have been intellectually honest to do so, but also because it wouldn't have helped the Tunisian people any. But there were ways that we felt the United States could help support the transition. And when I say we, I mean the entire US government. And just give some specific examples. One was President Obama's State of the Union address on January 25th.
And tonight, let us be clear. The United States of America stands with the people of Tunisia and supports the democratic aspirations of all people.
He gave, in the course of the address, he said, and we stand with the Tunisian people and their aspirations for democracy. For anyone familiar with the State of the Union address, that was an easy line for both parties to applaud, and both parties did, and gave, rose to their feet to give the Tunisian people a ovation. Now, maybe people were just trying to be nice to me because I represent the United States, but I had a lot of people after that, ministers in government, ordinary citizens, people in between, tell me in virtually the same exact words that brought tears to their eyes. And saying it also was very helpful because it gave them confidence looking ahead. Again, I don't want to overplay that because it was a Tunisian accomplishment, but sometimes even when you're going down the right road, a little encouragement can help. We also, we were fortunate in that the Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, Jeff Feltman, he had served in Tunisia, and he knew a lot of people who had been civil society activists in opposition and were now post-revolution in the government. He visited, he came on January 24th, just 10 days later. And I think that was, that also gave some confidence. It also helped, of course, that he knew a lot of these people from before. In contrast, there was at least one Arab foreign minister, whom I won't name, who canceled his visit. And I remember Tunisians saying, basically, we remember who our friends were and who our friends weren't at the time.
How did the U.S. try to support transitions to democracy? Here's Wittes again.
I was mainly working on the international coordination on the assistance side. What can we do to support transitions to democracy in Tunisia, where they're saying they want to have elections in June, and they haven't had a clean election in 30 years. Here was the problem. We're still coming out of a global recession in the spring of 2011. I have said before, I felt like we were trying to fund, support for this historic transformation in the region with the change we found in the couch cushions of the Function 150 account. Fortunately, I was running an assistance program that had fairly flexible funding. We were a region-wide pot of money. We were not, country by country allocated the way most of USAID's assistance in the region was allocated. Even so, we at the Middle East Partnership Initiative, the program I was running, we threw out our programming budget and rewrote it and re-notified it to come up with the first $20 million in US assistance to Tunisia.
Here's Ambassador Gray.
We started to try and be as creative as possible, and frankly, to be a bit ambitious. And some of our proposals, in all honesty, were deemed a little bit too ambitious until the prime minister visited Washington in October of that year, and all of a sudden Washington shifted into that famous, we need to identify deliverables for the visit, and some of those ambitious ideas were put into place. And we also looked at small, small victories along the way. I remember we sent in one cable, which we called the low-hanging fruit cable. I mean, colloquially in the embassy, and that wasn't the title of it. In other words, things that the United States could do and should do that wouldn't cost a great deal of money, but would help things. I mean, visa ban on Ben Ali and his family, freezing assets, using existing pots of money to provide assistance where we could, using emergency funds, things like that.
So just to sort of wrap things up here and take kind of a holistic look at the 10 years that we've had since the events you gentlemen have been discussing today, it's important to look back at what was going on in December of 2010, January 2011, and as a historian, it's fascinating as well because the nothing's preordained, like you guys have mentioned and talked about here. I mean, this could have gone any number of ways, as we saw in other countries, and in January, Ben Ali leaves, then in February, Mubarak leaves, and things are looking up for the Arab Spring. But then we have Ali Abdullah Saleh hanging on, and then the national dialogue movement and things sort of crumbling in Yemen, and we have a horrible humanitarian situation there now, and civil war. We've had an ongoing civil war in Syria. We've had the issues in Libya that continue today. So with that now having happened, looking back 10 years, what do you think are sort of the legacies of Tunisia, and how do you view sort of what's happened over the course of the past 10 years in Tunisia in light of what could have happened, what has happened in other countries?
From my perspective, I think the most important legacy of what happened in Tunisia, beyond just Tunisia and what it meant for that country, was it demonstrated both that how brittle dictatorships are, because you saw that not just in Tunisia, where things moved very quickly. Egypt, you could argue in one sense, and that's a whole nother discussion, but you could argue in one sense, Mubarak's fall was even faster. Tahrir Square started the demonstrations. The first demonstrations there were January 25th. He went into exile in Sharm el-Sheikh February 11th, so it was even faster than the 4 weeks. Gaddafi, February 17th to when he was killed in October. So I think one of the legacies is showing the brittleness of dictatorships. Another is the, not to sound cliched, but the power of the people, and the power that ordinary citizens can exercise. It's not always easy. It's usually very difficult to exercise. I don't want to minimize that, but it does show that unity of purpose can succeed. I think the broader question, or another broad question that many people ask, is Tunisia a model or an anomaly? And I think it's a great question. Youssef, I'll be very interested in your take on it. My view is, in many ways, it's probably more an anomaly than a model, in the sense that in Tunisia, there was a confluence of building blocks that are necessary for a successful transition. A long history of reform. Tunisia abolished slavery before the United States did. Long history of women's rights, be it Bourguiba's insistence that girls be educated just as boys were, Tunisian women got the right to vote before women in Switzerland did, for example. Exposure to democracy, relatively large middle class, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think those factors we certainly don't see them replicated in Syria or Yemen or Libya, 3 countries that are still engulfed in conflict. I would say those are all necessary building blocks for successful transition. And the question before us or before the Tunisian people is, are they sufficient? And time will tell. But I don't think, notwithstanding the economic problems Tunisia is currently going through, I think it is important to take a step back and realize what a tremendous accomplishment this was by the Tunisian people. And it's not just a story that began December 17th, 2010 and ended 10 years later. I mean, chapters are still being written in this history book.
But for me, I think, of course, when we look 10 years later, Tunisia is quite unique in its neighborhood, and the progress that was accomplished makes it stands apart. But then there are a number of things that makes it quite similar to the other countries around. I mean, when we talk about the history of reform and political reform, maybe Egypt has similarities. And I mean, right before 2010, Egypt was actually slightly freer than Tunisia, with more active political parties and political groups. Morocco also had a recent history of reforms and so on and so on. But maybe what makes Tunisia different, and maybe the big legacy or the big legacies, is one that democracy can happen in the MENA region, which is something that most of us accept today, but that 10 years ago, a lot of people would vote against it and say that, well, MENA people cannot live with democracy. So this is one very important legacy. But here it's important to remind people that in Tunisia you find many of the same problems that you find in the other Arab countries. But maybe the big difference is that, one, in Tunisia you don't have a lot of violent people with arms, be it civilian or non-government groups armed, or you don't have the army and the police of other Arab states that are willing and ready to kill thousands of people to keep the leadership in place. So this is something where Tunisia is different from the other MENA countries. Then there is the presence of a strong group that is the labor union, the UGTT, which is very strong, very powerful, but also civilian. So it's not an armed group. So it's a very powerful group that can push political leaders to act, but without violence. So I think this makes the Tunisian experience quite different from the other experiences around. However, it doesn't mean that in 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, what happened in Tunisia won't happen in the other countries in the region, especially that we've seen in the last 10 years that, yes, democracy is chaotic, but also authoritarian violence is maybe as chaotic and as destructive as democracy, and even more so. So once these violent authoritarian regimes that we see in the MENA region today start collapsing, then the Tunisian model can really become a model.
As the conversation between Gordon and Youssef drew to a close, we asked them for their reflections on any decisions they think should have been taken differently, both in the last 10 years and over the longer term.
Well, in looking back, I'm pleased with where we came out on providing assistance to Tunisia. I wish we could have been a little bit more nimble and a little faster in sharing that assistance with Tunisia. I think part of it was that the events happened and since they spread to Egypt and Libya and throughout the region. Washington's bandwidth was just limited, so it wasn't. It was a sin of omission, not a sin of commission. People were just overwhelmed. If I had had the magic wand, that is the one thing I would have changed from the perspective of the embassy in Tunis.
So I'll give two answers. The broader answer is that I wish that in the 70s and the 80s, a more structural reform had taken place and maybe a smaller opening had taken place. If we had that from the 70s and 80s, the situation would be much better today. Then if I go closer to the last 10 years, I think the compromises that we've seen among politicians, if they were reflected at a more social level, if we had maybe more discussion groups, the ones we had in 2011 among different groups of the population, if we had that applicated at a nationwide level and to have different people discuss with each other on politics, maybe things would have been better today.